Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Mario Thurger and today I'm going to talk about and show you the similarities between some Balkan religious symbols with the Icelandic magic symbols or staves. Our first video with decorations to celebrate the season of Mariah Carey, and I'm not sure if you can see it, also a tree, which is the most pagan way of celebrating the birth of the baby boy of a fictional character. I'm not making any friends here. One of my previous videos in relation to Galdra Stafir, Icelandic Magic Staves, was precisely showing the similarities between Umbanda symbols with the Galdra Stafir, especially with the Agisjalmur and such other similar symbols. On that video, I have presented a cultural background from which such symbols have had their origins. However, today I would like to show you some religious symbols of the Balkans from Southeast Europe, and you will certainly find many similarities with the Icelandic magic staves. The symbols I will show you today from the Balkans are mainly a religious tradition from northwest of the Balkan Peninsula, and even though it's a tradition mostly associated with Croatia, other countries also share this tradition, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia and the former Yugoslavia. It is an interesting set of symbols, part of a tradition of tattooing these symbols on one's body. Before we delve into this, let me show you already some of the similarities. Here, somewhere, I present to you the symbol named Kolo, which refers to family and community because of its circular shape. And in some of the sources I have gathered, it seems to also be a symbol related to the fir tree. I take the opportunity to say that Kolo is also a traditional dance from Croatia, Bosnia and Serbia, which is a collective folk dance where those involved are interlinked to form a chain, usually moving in a circular line, holding hands with their arms down, right? As you can see, there's undoubtedly similarities with these specific Icelandic magic staves, and further ahead we shall see a lot more similarities. Kolo is an important religious symbol of the Balkans with an integrative social function. It is a symbol of national identity which helps to reinforce regional communal identities. But we shall see more of this further ahead. Don't worry. So, with no more delay, let's start our today's video, shall we? Please. Well then, in case you haven't watched my video concerning the common misconceptions in relation to Icelandic magic symbols, I suggest you do that just to have a better understanding of the cultural basis associated to such symbols. However, I will once again specifically focus on a few points because I think it's important so we may understand the original cultural historical point from which these symbols have originated from and developed. Because this will also help us to understand the cultural background that gave origins to the Balkan religious symbols I'm presenting here today. The Icelandic magic staves are often thought to be of pagan origins, specifically of the Viking Age, but they are not. The Galdrastafir, magic symbols of Iceland, are symbols that have appeared in Icelandic grimoires, spell books, right, since the 1500s. So we are talking about a symbolic tradition that only appears in Iceland at the beginning of the 16th century, of the Common Era, obviously, half a century after the end of the Scandinavian Iron Age, commonly known as Viking Age. The oldest manuscript containing, let's say, Proto-Galdrastafir is the small manuscript known as the Lightning Gakver, Book of Physicians. It is from the early 1500s and is kept in Copenhagen. Here in this manuscript we find a mixture of herbal remedies, cures for illnesses, spells for misfortunes and more. It suggests that magic and medicine were pretty much the same thing at the time, and usually the administration of a substance to heal the patient was often accompanied by symbology and prayers and even invocations, which was quite common throughout Europe still. Here we have already been able to identify the type of symbol that would give rise to the more complex Icelandic magic symbols later on, and a development of these symbols until at least the 18th and the 19th centuries. As you can see, we can also see here the similarity with the kolo symbol of the community, and also the Croatian Bosnian tattooed sign of protection. We also have this other Icelandic symbol from the same time to discover the identity of a thief. I won't repeat myself, so if you can and have patience, then please watch the video I've mentioned a moment ago. But we must remember that associated with this specific symbol you see right here somewhere, associated to it, there is a Christian belief, to be more precise, a dualistic view that is typically Christian. This is what we must understand, that we are facing a non-pagan, but rather a Christian tradition associated with these symbols. Eventually, in Iceland, these symbols will develop and evolve, reaching the present form of the famous Algisialmur that appears in the 17th century paper manuscript known as Galrakver, Book of Magic, kept in the National Library of Iceland. As I said earlier in other videos, to understand the origins of this symbolic development, it is necessary to search for what was happening in other European countries at the same time in the field of occult sciences, and not just focus on a single historical geographic reality. In the Renaissance, a new type of esotericism spread across Europe, based largely on a tradition that appears to have Jewish origins and which, let's say, contemplates the summoning of demons, controlling them and making them do a variety of different things. The demonic evocation is carried out through the use of specific seals or sigils collected in large numbers in one of the most widespread texts of European esotericism, the Clavicle of King Solomon, or simply known as the Key of Solomon, Clavicula Solomanis. Many were the magical treatises that emerged and circulated based on these texts. Texts that contain instructions and the sigils associated with each demon and how to supposedly summon demonic entities for the most diverse purposes. What is known as Goetia or Goetia, which became quite famous even within the Catholic Church in the practices of necromancy in the very late medieval period and the early modern period and throughout the modern period. Therefore, in Europe, a magical knowledge circulates that will influence the creation of the Icelandic magic symbols, which draw an inspiration from the source of continental esotericism, and not from some pagan tradition of which there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But I explore this in more depth in the video that I've mentioned previously, and in that video I also present to you the sources, the bibliography that I've used, so you can explore for yourselves. Now, in the 1400s, in Greece, a very interesting manuscript appears, the Harley 5596, which contains one of the oldest surviving witnesses of King Solomon's sigils, found in the famous Key of Solomon. I think you can notice something quite curious and familiar with the Icelandic symbols, especially with the Algisialmur and Veikvisir. So, we must retain this. In the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire collapsed with the Turkish advance. Greek scholars took refuge in Europe and brought with them a considerable amount of classical knowledge which would help triggering the Renaissance. These scholars brought with them new forms of occultic magic and medicine based on Jewish, classical and Christian beliefs, which eventually influenced Icelanders into creating Gadrastafir, especially in the creation of Algisialmar type of symbols, influenced by symbols such as the ones on the Harley 5596 manuscript from the 1400s in Greece, containing one of the oldest surviving documentations of the tradition of the Key of Solomon. You can see the picture right here somewhere. Some aesthetic elements of the Solomonic-inspired demonic seals would be reassembled, remade and developed to produce a new Icelandic idiosyncratic tradition. At the beginning of the modern era, Icelanders were able to elaborate elements inherited from European occult culture integrating them into a unique local tradition. And this is probably exactly the same thing that has happened in the Balkans, a development of a series of symbols brought by Greek refugees when the Turkish advance broke down the Byzantine Empire. So let's see. So, in the northwestern region of the Balkans, there are very interesting symbols which are part of the tattoo tradition of Croatia, Bosnia, and the former Yugoslavia. Although this is a tradition for all genders, the great majority of these tattoos are carried by women on the hands and arms, mostly of Croatian women in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The symbols in question are of Christian tradition, and this tradition originates precisely from the places once occupied by the Turks in the time of the Ottoman Empire. As said before, these symbols match those of the Key of Solomon, of Jewish and Christian traditions, and when the Turkic advance broke down the Byzantine Empire by the late 15th century, these symbols were brought by Greek refugees, and so such symbols were adopted by many peoples, Icelandic included later on, but also people from Croatia, Bosnia, and such regions of northern western Balkans. The purpose of tattooing these symbols in the Balkan traditions was to prevent the kidnapping of young Christian women and to prevent their conversion to Islam. Of course, I am speaking about these specific symbols and not the tradition of tattooing one's body with magical symbols and symbols of protection, because this tradition of tattooing, specifically around these parts in the Balkan Peninsula, possibly has its origins since the Iron Age from Illyrian and Celtic traditions. But these specific symbols we are dealing with today are most likely a tradition brought by the Greeks during the 1400s, of the Common Era, obviously. These symbols are Christian symbols, the same way they were Judeo-Christian symbols within the Byzantine Empire. And such symbols served as protection against the Ottoman invasions and occupation of these territories. In fact, this tradition was widespread among Eastern Roman Catholics within the Byzantine Empire. So indeed, it makes sense the similarities with the symbols of the Key of Solomon in Greece in the 1400s. The traditional symbols are crosses, sometimes tattooed around the women's wrists, which are called narukvika, by the way, bracelets or wristband, which are quite similar to some Icelandic magic staves. We are in the presence of Christian crosses. The cross symbol also has other variations, of course, that resemble pine trees or fir trees. But it isn't solely Christian or Judeo-Christian motifs, obviously, because these crosses or these cross symbols are inserted in compositions that are part of the traditions of these peoples related to traditional dance, as previously spoken, as an example. We are in the presence of a fusion of religious motifs from different religious belief systems, some older, some more recent, in a beautiful composition of patterns and motifs that are part of a cultural identity of the Balkans history. I think we can place these tattoos or these symbols into at least four main categories according to their meanings and purposes. I've already mentioned kolo as the kolo type symbols, which are inserted in different compositions, which are the circles representing the community. There is the ograda, which represents the fence, as in a protective barrier. Another one is Jelicin Kridzic, the fir cross, which is a cross with ornaments. And the other one I have already spoken about, narukvika, the bracelet or wristband. The tradition of tattooing these symbols was almost lost at a certain point, but it was still very much alive in central Bosnia until the late 50s of the 20th century at least. After the Second World War, it was forbidden because of the Yugoslav relation towards religion. But forbidden doesn't mean that people stopped doing it, obviously. But indeed, there was a considerable decline in this tradition after the Second World War. But this tradition is coming back, actually, being revived quite recently. While I was making my research on these symbols and tradition, I have stumbled upon some modern tattooists who are bringing back this tradition, and many people with Croatian and Bosnian roots and from former Yugoslavia are progressively developing an interest in their cultural traditions and having these tattoos done on their skin. The origins and purpose of these traditional tattoos take place in former Yugoslavia, occupied by the Turks in the time of the Ottoman Empire. And as said before, the purpose was to prevent the kidnapping of Croat or Croatian Christian young women in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to avoid their conversion to Islam. Protective symbols, right? Protection against enemies, but also the protection or to protect their identity and culture. This is quite curious, as we see many European cultures using a lot of forms of expression to maintain and remember their Christian cultural identity while under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. Even before that, actually, we see similar behaviors when Southern Europe was occupied by the Islamic Caliphate during the Middle Ages. And although people were converted to Islam and they had been integrated into the Islamic medieval kingdoms, and the Islamic Caliphate of the Middle Ages was actually quite benevolent, and many Christians were allowed to keep their faith and customs actually. But even so, there's a series of motifs and behaviors from generation to generation to preserve their Christian pre-Islamic cultural identities. And this is quite noticeable in archaeology, because the process of conversion to Islam or being under Islamic rule often made people adopt Muslim names. So to avoid forgetting the previous cultural identity or self-identity, there's a series of hidden motifs that helped to remember. But let's not drift away from the subject and go into the Middle Ages. Let's move forward again. Here in the Balkans, the Ottoman invasions between the 15th and the 19th centuries has this specific impact upon these peoples, and the tradition of tattooing their bodies with these symbols was, let's say, augmented to preserve their Christian identity. The intention wasn't merely to ornament the body, but to protect women from being kidnapped, but also just in case they were kidnapped, these symbols would help them to remember their Christian faith if they were forced to convert to Islam eventually. Anyway, I thought you would enjoy knowing about this subject, and once again, yet another cultural background that helps us to understand the origins of these symbols that in the late 15th and throughout the 16th centuries finally reached Iceland, and in there the symbols have had a series of developments until at least the 19th century, giving rise to the most famous symbols of Icelandic esoteric and occultic history, such as the Ægisjalmur and Vegvisir, which are not pagan at all. They are not from the Viking Age, but are in fact Judeo-Christian symbols developed in Eastern Europe within the Byzantine Empire, being influenced by Jewish and other Near Eastern cultural developments and belief systems that formed the signs and sigils within the Key of Solomon. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.